Okay, well, let's get started. I know people are kind of filtering in, but welcome. Very happy to have everybody here. My name is Corey Thane. I'm Vice President of Global Policy at Circle, and we are here to talk about the dollar challenge and what we might be able to do to strengthen the U.S. dollar in face of increasing competition around the globe. And I can't think of two better people with whom to have this conversation. With us today, we have Jelena McWilliams and Chris Giancarlo, and they both have extraordinarily distinguished careers. Jelena has a wealth of experience in business, law, and policy. She's the former, today she's a partner at Cravath, which, if you don't know, is one of the most elite law firms in the country. And she's previously chair of the FDIC, which came after a long career in business and government, including stints at the Federal Reserve as chief counsel of the Senate Banking Committee, and also as chief legal officer of Fifth Third Bank. So very excited about this. Chris has an equally deep experience in business law and policy, as a former commissioner and then chair of the CFTC. But prior to that, he was executive vice president of a big company here in New York. Today, he's senior counsel at Willkie Farr, another elite law firm. He is on the board of directors of Nomura Securities. He is a founder of the Digital Dollar Project, and he's also the author of Crypto Dad, The Fight for the Future of Money. So we have the right people on stage for this conversation. And Jelena and Chris, thank you so much for being here. We're truly honored to have you. So let's just start off with a pretty broad question here. Why is the dollar being challenged today? I think we've seen geopolitical shifts. And just one data point that stands out to me is that in 2015, the dollar was 66% of foreign currency reserves. Today, that's down to 58%. And in the earlier 2000s, it was up over 70%. Just one data point. But there's lots of things afoot in the world. And so maybe I can start with you, Jelena. And then not only why, but what can the U.S. do from policymakers and beyond to ensure the strength of the dollar moving forward?
Sure. And thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you today. So I will tell you that the challenge to the U.S. dollar as the world currency and the world reserve is not new. There were always folks that would have liked to have dollar not be the dominant currency on the world stage. What is new relatively in the last 10 or so years is that some of these challenges have become more forceful. And you have BRICS countries coming up with their currency. You have, in the crypto space, in the digital currency space, you have folks who, even though the stable coin all throughout the world is mainly backed up by the US dollar, who would actually like to take that away. And I will tell you this, I think that we should want the US dollar to remain the dominant currency, both for the reserves of the world banks, but also as a currency that you trade in the world. As somebody who grew up in a different system, I grew up in the former Yugoslavia. I literally remember the price of the Levi's 501 jeans was pegged to the dollar value. So you knew it was going to be, either 200 Deutschmarks or about 150 US dollars, and how much that translated into Yugoslav dinars would depend on any given day. And so as a kid, you're looking at the exchange course, trying to figure out when is the cheapest day to buy my 501s. Because you saved, for a year to get them. So it's an anecdote that really highlights how, unless you were born outside the United States and you had to deal with the currencies that are not predominant currencies and that, frankly, for most part are unstable compared to the US dollar, you did encounter instances where your food prices would be different based on where the exchange rate is. So I do think we have a vested interest both on the national security level as policymakers as well as just business minded people to maintain the dominance of the US dollar, and that's something that, frankly, during my tenure in the United States Senate at the Fed and at the FDIC, I have been a big supporter of the US dollar in general. So it's great to be here with you.
Yeah, you gave me a flashback to studying abroad in Europe and before the euro, and going from country to country and always having to change out your money. And I had very little money at the time, right? And you're always like comparing it. How many do I get for the dollar? How many do I get for the dollar? So yeah. Chris, you had some thoughts.
Yeah. Before we sort of talk about the threats to the dollar, I think it's worth taking a moment to actually recognize how remarkable the dollar's ascendancy really is. Historically speaking, there's never been a currency like what the dollar has been for the last 50 years in terms of a truly global benchmark for value and prices and as a store of value. Even at the height of the Roman Empire, the Roman solidus coin worked in the empire, but outside of the empire just didn't have that same global effect. And since the fall of Rome, there's never been a currency as powerful as the dollar. Perhaps the one that people might point to is during the period of the European exploration of the Western Hemisphere. There were many currencies used up and down the east coast of North and South America, European currencies, Dutch guilders, British pounds, French livres, but the one that was most in demand was the dollar. But it wasn't the American dollar, it was the Spanish dollar. And the Spanish dollar didn't have nearly the global demand that the US dollar did, but it was preferenced. And it's interesting to note, because I think it'll come on into our conversation as we go on, one of the reasons it was so preferenced was it was technologically superior to the other currencies. It was technologically superior because it was minted using New World silver rather than Old World silver, which was more consistently pure, meant it was more fungible, one coin to the next, but also it needed less alloy, which made it actually lighter. But the most important feature was it was minted in such a way that it can be broken up into 8 equal pieces, known as pieces of 8, which made it fractionable. So it made it easier to use in commerce because it was easier to make change. And it's interesting, that was so preferable that when the United States created its own currency, it modeled it on the Spanish dollar. We call it the dollar, but also the dollar, if you think about it, is actually divisible into 8. Half dollars, quarter dollars, and what we used to call bits, which we don't use that term anymore, but 12.5 cents. So you can divide the dollar into 8, which was modeled on the Spanish dollar. The reason I mention that is, and we'll talk about this, technological aspects of currency really do matter, and we see that in history. But for the last 50 years, the dollar has been so dominant that we kind of have come to expect that as almost a birthright to some degree. The French call it the exorbitant privilege that America enjoys. And I agree with Jelena that I think the dollar has been very good for America, but I also think it's been very good for the globe. And I would argue that preserving the dollar's reserve currency status is really important for the globe. The reason we've had 30 years of globalization, more people have, as a result of that, have come out of poverty in the last 30 years of this period of globalization than ever before in human history, is because of the dollar giving the world a standard benchmark for value, a standard a store of value that's been generally consistent, generally superior in terms to other currencies in its ability to retain value. And as we think about how do we go in the future and preserving that benefit, I think technological capability is going to have to be one of the features that we build into the future of money and the future of the US dollar.
That's fascinating. I need to
there
go
will be
back
a quiz.
I mean, that history is amazing. We obviously at Circle think a lot about technological competition, and I think you might be the best spokesperson for that, Chris. And in fact, you were bringing back memories of, I had a case back in the day in Venezuela, and the moment I got off the plane, the police tried to take my dollars, and I had been warned that this could happen. I didn't know it was going to be the police. Why? Because they had something at the time called the Bolívares Fuertes, which were not as strong as they said, right? And so we see all around the world, people still want the dollar. And at Circle, we're trying to make it technologically feasible and competitive for them to have that. So with that, how do you think about like stable coins fitting into that framework and CBDCs? And and I know you have very developed views on CBDCs, Chris, but like, should policymakers be thinking about like promoting stable coins vis-a-vis CBDCs? Should they be thinking about them coexisting? So I'd love to just open it up to both of you for that.
So I come out the digital future of money really from one clear road, one clear line of thinking. And it is simply, how do we future-proof the dollar? How do we preserve its reserve currency status in a future where value will increasingly move away from the way it's been recorded for the last 400 years, which is on the balance sheets of proprietary commercial institutions like banks and asset managers and others, onto distributed ledger systems, some of which are decentralized like Bitcoin and Ethereum, others which are very centralized, run by governments or private sector actors like stablecoin operators. How do we preserve the dollar in that world? And that's the question that I formed a foundation, the Digital Dollar Foundation. We've launched the Digital Dollar Project, and it's all about that. How do we preserve that? Now, we are going to go into a future where there will be central bank digital currencies. Over 130 countries are working on it now. All 19 of the G20 are working on some form of central bank digital currency. And we will have stablecoins, some of which are operated by Circle, PayPal, and others, which are making great strides, increasing customer usage. And so in that future, how do we preserve the role of the dollar, which as I've argued, I believe is a net good? And I think what we need to think about is, what's made the dollar as strong as it is? Well, it's been the network effect of the dollar. One of the things that makes the dollar so strong is its use in commerce, its use to value most of the world's commodities. It's the informal network of dollar usage. In the future, as we go to digital networks, how do we enhance the role of the dollar? Well, I think the answer has got to be, we want as much network effect as possible, which means US policy should be dollar-based stablecoin innovation. US policy should be exploring a central bank digital currency. Whether the US deploys one or not, we need to make sure that every central bank digital currency in the world is interoperable with the dollar. And so I believe that if we're going to preserve the dollar's reserve currency status, if we're going to future-proof the dollar, then it's got to be a US policy to make sure that all the digital network innovation references the dollar, works with the dollar, is interoperable with the dollar. And that's why I wholly support stablecoin legislation. That's got to be the first step in making sure that stablecoins here in the that the stablecoin movement is centered here in the United States and centered on the dollar.
Yeah. And I would echo that as a matter of public policy for the US dollar-backed stablecoin. It doesn't have to be just a dollar-denominated, and reserved stablecoin, so long as it's backed by high-quality liquid assets, just like we require banks to back up some of the other asset categories when we do risk weighting for capital and liquidity purposes. But I also will add one more thing that people maybe, especially if they're born in the United States, take more or less for granted. One of the reasons that the dollar is the world's dominant currency is the rule of law. And the fact that you can underwrite these contracts and denominate them in the US dollar and know that the private property protections that the United States jurisprudence and the civil law system provides is something that is really hard to find in other countries, which brings me to, you just heard, and I just heard it briefly, I don't know exactly what he said, but you heard Chairman McHenry from the House Financial Services Committee talk about, this is why we need the law. You want to have the law on the books that basically provides for something like this so that the future contracts, however they may be underwritten, I'm a lawyer, so I think of a pen and paper, and then it became computer and the clicks and the printer, and now it became like a digital signature. Whatever these future contracts may look like, that they are protected by the rule of law, that basically protects private property in the United States, that basically then can be backed up by the US dollar. So it's kind of like the ecosystem has to work, and for that ecosystem, the next step has to be legislation that basically leads us there, whatever form it may take. I'll leave it to the people who are elected to decide, but I do think that's the path.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly think like stablecoin legislation is it's about dollar access, it's about dollar safety and competitiveness and consumer protection. I mean, some of the, Chairman McHenry said this, some of the major blow-ups in frauds would not have been possible under a good rational framework.
And they didn't take place under the CFTC framework, which prevented it. The one part of the FTX empire that stands today is the part regulated by the CFTC.
Yeah, good, excellent point. Excellent point. When we're thinking about CBDCs, one of the interesting features of this money that I think is a little bit underrated is programmability, and not just faster and cheaper on the blockchain. And so I think in a rule of law type of country or economic bloc, programmability could be a very good thing, but it could also be a very bad thing in a autocratic type of country, right? And so, when we think about China, they now have a CBDC that's in the hands of 300 million people. They're taking very deliberate steps, as they tend to do, to increase that. And they're also working on infrastructure like Project Enbridge, right? I mean, should we be concerned? Should we be taking steps to sort of counter that with better alternatives? Or is the concern, potentially overblown? So
I had the honor of serving on a Hoover Institute study that did the first deep dive into China's ECNY, its digital currency, and we issued a report to the Biden administration. It's funny, I'm somewhat wistful about having served on that committee and delivered the report because we raised the point about it being a surveillance tool to such an extent now that unfortunately I think in the minds of many policymakers, some policymakers in Washington, whenever they think about central bank digital currency, they think about the Chinese model and assume that's the only model there could be. And I think they superimpose that here in their politics in the United States. And so therefore, you hear Washington politicians and some think tanks railing against CBDC. The one they're railing against is the Chinese model. But it's almost an insult to a free people in a democracy, because why would we even think about that for the dollar? It would be an insult to the strength of the dollar. Why wouldn't we create, if we're going to create a central bank digital currency, why wouldn't we create one that has privacy, has our constitutional freedoms built into it? And there's no reason why we can't. The technology exists. Whenever you go from analog to digital, design it the way you want. We could design a U.S. central bank digital currency with privacy built in and wouldn't even need the government to say, trust us, we're not surveilling you. It could be operationally transparent enough that one can see for themselves that they're not being surveilled and worse, censored by the government. And so that's what we should be, that should be our model in the United States. That should be what we develop. When we think about central bank digital currency, we should be, when we think about a digital dollar, whether it's private sector operated by a stable coin or government operated, we should only be thinking about one that is operationally transparent, where surveillance and censorship is not possible. Now, that by surveillance, I mean by identity. There's no reason why we couldn't balance law enforcement with privacy by using pseudonymity as the basis. And government can do big data analysis, look for pattern recognition, see patterns of likely unlawful behavior, in the same way we do highway law enforcement. When there's a pattern, driving without your headlights, speeding, reckless driving, government can then interdict the behavior, unmask the perpetrators subject to probable cause and our notions of law, and then get identity. Identity when there's reason to believe that there's criminality, as opposed to what we do today in our analog world. Before we even get to central bank digital currency, the government gathers way more information than is justified. It's all personally identified. And so I think the prospect of a U.S. digital dollar should be an opportunity for us as a free people in our democratic society to reassess what is the right balance between a free people engaging in economic activity and a government's duty to interdict unlawful behavior. And I think that this is the opportunity we have today to really rethink where we are today in our existing system, which I think has gone way off the rails. What do we want to do in a new future the new digital future of money? And I think if we really get our voices heard, we could get this really right, and we could create a U.S. central bank digital currency and U.S. dollar-based stablecoins that the world will flock to because they want to escape the surveillance that's being done by government, and will flock to dollar-based instruments because there they can enjoy economic liberty and economic privacy for lawful activity.
And I'll add that we do have privacy laws on the books that govern financial transactions and disclosure information and the gathering of consumer information. You know, whether we need more, most of those laws were enacted 20 plus years ago and older. And the truth of the matter is that we can probably tweak some of the existing laws to accommodate the new digital currencies, but some new laws are probably necessary to account for the, you know, how do you move stuff on distributed ledger, and how is every step of the way protected from the privacy concerns. But you know what, there are going to be all these people who are, no matter what you do, no matter how much you protect their privacy or claim to protect their privacy, they're not going to trust the system. And so whatever percentage that is, you're not going to change their minds. There are going to be people who are skeptical of the system. You know, in a lot of countries, you don't put money in a bank. Why? You don't trust the bank. You don't trust that your money is safe, and you don't trust that the bank will not confiscate your money, or that the government won't take your money, or that somehow your financial transactions will be reported. So you do have foreign nationals coming to the United States, you know, buying up condos in Miami in order for them to open up a checking account in the United States. And we also saw during the early months of the COVID pandemic, when government was distributing money through the PPP program and other payment programs that were done under the CARES Act, you saw that people who didn't have a checking account needed to open up to get. It was so inefficient, it is incredible. So there is some percentage of the United States population, something like 5%, that doesn't have a checking account. And you have to look at who they call, you know, population to see exactly what this 5% means. So then the government is going to send money for the people who actually don't have checking accounts. So in order for them to get the government check, they would have to go to the bank and open up an account. Yep. I mean, incredibly, and then they run into the know your customer, you know, bank secrecy, anti-money laundering protocols at the banks. So it takes like 3 or 4 days to open up a checking account. It was like incredibly inefficient, that when you really look at just the pure economies of scale, the efficiencies, and the speed of movement of money, I mean, it's a no-brainer. We should have something that's akin to, you know, a stable coin or digital dollar, whatever it ends up being called.
Yeah, and they've got to do it physically in the middle of a pandemic, right? They got to get down to the bank, and yeah. So some have talked a little bit about the generational divide. You know, I think young people are using stable coins and other types of crypto in, you know, much greater numbers than an older generation. And we faced something like this in the past when the internet was developing. And as I understand it, at that time, policymakers almost overregulated like the protocols that they came to their senses and sort of let it develop. Do you think, given the generational divide that we have today, that can be bridged in time to get this right before the technology sort of runs away in a vacuum?
There's a novelist named Doug Adams who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, one of my favorite authors. And he's got a great quote. I'm going to butcher it now, but I'll do my best with it. And it basically says, anything that's invented before you turn 35 is way cool and probably the basis for a lifetime career. And anything that's invented after you turn 35 is dangerous, suspect, and needs to be suppressed. I think that's a lot of what's going on right now. I think we've got a particularly septuagenarian generation running most things in Washington and in financial services. They didn't grow up in a networked world, and the notion of of digitally networking finance is particularly frightening to them. And I think they've started to confuse financial stability with defending the status quo of an analog financial system. And I think we're in a particularly repressive period because of the leadership. And Jelena and I served with some of these septuagenarians during our time in Washington. And
You said it, I didn't.
We served with them, alongside them. But look, it is what it is. I mean, the further you go down the generational chain, the more you see acceptance and to think that somehow the internet, which changed everything we know about social networking, about entertainment, about retail shopping, is somehow not going to do that to finance banking and money, is just naive thinking. But I think we've got a generational issue. Perhaps the good thing about life is it cures that on its own, right? Yeah. Life's a conveyor belt, and the people that are at the end of the conveyor belt will fall off the conveyor belt, and the next generation will come. And I don't say that to be mean, because I'm pretty far along the conveyor belt myself, but it just will. We will get a younger generation that understands the power of digital networks, and they'll bring that understanding to finance and to markets and to banking and to money. Money will move into digital networked formats, and if we in the United States are the laggards in this, others are going to get the jump on us. Now, Jay Powell is absolutely right. We don't want to be first in time, but we do want our principles and our values to proliferate, and that's why we need to be at the leadership table, even if we move deliberately and with due pace. But we do need to be at the leadership table.
Yeah.
And if I may just quickly add, the people will adjust. And I think, we used to measure the importance of the branches in the United States banking system by how often people go to get their money. By law, you're required to have an FDIC sticker that basically says your deposits are insured up to $250,000 per depositor per account. And then we started debating at the FDIC, well, people don't go to branches anymore. So what does that mean? That means that we got to figure out, how to do this online for folks who don't go to branches. And the reason you're seeing a lot of branches closing is because the foot traffic is just not there. So people adjust. But we actually ran a little, I called it our own little social experiment, when COVID broke out, and all of a sudden there was the government mandated shutdown of businesses, and people started getting cash out of the bank. So even people who never go to banks started just pulling cash en masse. And we started getting calls to the FDIC from some of the bank CEOs saying, we're losing like large deposits. I mean, tens of thousands of dollars, in some cases $100,000 withdrawal. And so, we talked to the Federal Reserve, money needed to be dispatched, the currency needed to be dispatched. And if you were driving around the country around that time, you would go in front of the gas stations and it says, we have a currency shortage. So they didn't have enough quarters, they didn't have stuff. I mean, it was fascinating if you ended up driving anywhere. So we did a public service announcement. I was told by brighter people than me that we should do a public service announcement. And so I did, and I'm like, okay, we should. And then they were like, you should do it. And I said, I should do it. Okay, I should do it. I'll do it. So completely unscripted, like say something for the camera. Keep your money in the bank. Your money is safe in the bank. Don't put your money in the mattress. There's no need to pull money out of the bank. I mean, I think I was a little bit more articulate, but not a whole lot than that. And so we post this video on then Twitter, and for the FDIC, we go viral. So we have like 1,200 comments. And so I'm like, I'm going to read the comments. I'm just curious. And my staff is like, don't read the comments. Oh, now I really have to read the comments, right? So from the 1,200 comments, about 50% said if the FDIC chairman says your money is safe in the bank, buy gold. The next 45%, so I'm like, these are over 40. The next 45% basically said if the FDIC chairman says your money is safe in the bank, buy Bitcoin. And I was like, these are under 40. And then of the other 5%, I think some small percentage said, oh, she's doing exactly what she's supposed to do. And the rest said, we didn't know the FDIC is run by a Russian. And all kinds of concerns with that. So that was our little social experiment, who does what in a crisis mode. So I will tell you that the breakdown between the buy gold and buy Bitcoin, neither of which were the messages or the intent behind the public service announcement, were about even. So either more of those people spend time on social media, or we're going to bridge this digital divide.
Yeah.
And I'm not Russian.
We're
Nothing against that, but I'm just not.
We're back to the gold buying. I just saw in a news article yesterday about Costco selling out
You know
bars?
what I did? I saw that. So I'm a big Costco shopper. I can tell you what's on aisle 11, aisle 12. I hate when they move stuff around so you can go shopping. I know how they mark down stuff from 99 cents, 97, 79. I'm like, I should run Costco. If the Costco CEO is anywhere here, I should run Costco. And I went on Costco website immediately when I read that article, and I was like, gold, because there was a screenshot somebody posted, and it says, gold bar. And I put down in search engine gold bar, and it says item cannot be found. So for what it's worth, I'm not sure Costco really sold gold bricks or gold bars, because if they did, I would know exactly which aisle it's on. And I didn't see it, and I'm at Costco once a week.
It felt a little out of place, so thanks for confirming. I know we're starting to run out of time, but just want to at least, we could talk for 2 hours. So let's just kind of like look out at the medium term, given all of this technological flux and the geopolitical things that are happening. Let's just say it's 2035. Is the dollar strengthened from where it's at today? Is it weakened? If it's strengthened, what did policymakers do right? And if you think it's going to weaken, what can we do to forestall that outcome today?
Well, it depends. It's going to depend on a lot of things, right? The strength of a currency ultimately ties down to the strength of its underlying economy and the policies underlying it. If we continue to print dollars the way we've printed dollars in the last 4 years, it'd be hard for the dollar, I think, to continue the role it's in. We've got to get some degree of discipline in Washington on our spending. It's also going to depend what other countries do. You've heard it here. I predict that within 10 years, we'll have the Chinese digital currency in the Western Hemisphere in the form of white-labeled currencies from Latin American countries. I think you'll see a digital bolivar by the end of the decade that will be basically a white-label version of Chinese digital currency technology. And I think that will be a spur to the United States to take this more seriously. Because once a currency is out of the dollar zone, it's basically networked into a new zone, a new digital network zone integrated with China and its Belt and Road Initiative. The digital euro is coming. That's going to make it possible to have the ability to move from stable coins into a sovereign currency in and out digitally. And I'll argue that one of the reasons people are comfortable putting their money in the bank is because they know in a crisis they can run down to the ATM machine and take it out. In a similar way, I think there's a symbiotic relationship between stable coins and digital currency, because people will be comfortable going into a stable coin or into a crypto, knowing they can convert into a sovereign currency if they need to. And I think the Europeans have that in mind for the digital euro. I don't know if that concept is yet dawned in Washington. So I think when you say where are we going to be in 15 years, a lot depends on the light bulbs going off in Washington, that we need to make sure that the dollar is part of as many digital networks as possible, because digital networks of value are coming, and some are going to be run by governments like the Chinese and the Europeans, many of which are going to be run by players like Circle and PayPal, and we need to make sure the dollar is the basis for as many digital networks as possible. And if we do, and if we can stop the profligacy in Washington and get some fiscal discipline and get our house in order, then I think the dollar could continue to serve the important role that it has served.
And I'll add to that, and somebody who spent about 6 years in the Senate, slightly over 6, and actually participated in some of the debates on the increasing the debt limit on the Senate Finance Committee, et cetera. I agree with everything you said, but I will also add that some of that will depend how good the country's other economies and other countries around the world are. When you see the time of crisis, people flock to treasury markets in the United States. And why do they like to buy U.S. treasuries? Why do they believe that it's better to invest here than someplace else? It partly is because we have the foremost financial markets in the world. Part of it is that we have the rule of law that protects private property. Part of that is that the United States is a relatively stable economy. Even when we go up and down, it's like I joke, it's like a Gallup poll. We go this way 3%, but we don't go like 30%. We don't do these big swings like most other governments. But really, the reason people come and do invest in our markets and our companies is because just about everywhere else is less safe. And so the question is going to be, in addition to the fiscal order and, the laws that would provide for stablecoin and the digital dollar to be in place, I think the real question is also going to be, are others doing better than us? Is there a system that can replace us in terms of the strength and the faith of the others in the stability of that system? And you had European Union try to do that, but they're still disenfranchised in so many ways in their markets. And nothing else came close. You see BRICS now, more and more countries joining the BRICS bloc. But the truth of the matter is, they're not always considered the most friendly countries to the consumer, right? Whether they're dictatorships or whatever else they may be. So I do think it's going to depend on kind of not just like what we do home with an economic situation. We could still be in trouble with our debt ceiling and all of that, but the others could be in bigger trouble and they'll still come to our markets.
Yes, indeed.
So I think it's like a careful
Agreed.
ecosystem and a dance we'll have to do, So long as they're worse than us, it's like you don't want to be the slowest swimmer in the water where there's a shark. So we don't need to be the fastest. So long as those guys are slower, we're still okay, right?
Agreed.
So hopefully we don't get to that point.
Yeah.
But Chris, with your observation about essentially like a China whitelisted Bolivar or whatever, I mean, is it, in your view, inevitably moving to a bipolar world of yuan dominance and dollar dominance?
So, I began by saying that I think the period we've seen of 50 years of dollar dominance is relatively unique in human history. And so, you're going to see some reversion to the mean anyway. But I think we're going into a multipolar world. And I think you're going to see absolutely China's digital currency rolled out alongside its Belt and Road. I mean, and some of that is just foreign aid. I mean, the amount of money that China is distributing around the world dwarfs what we're doing now in the United States. And with it will come an obligation. We're building your water treatment facility in East Africa. Yeah. The payments on that are now payable in digital yuan directly to the People's Bank of China. They're no longer going to go through American banks. You're on our digital system now. And that's going to be part of that. The digital euro, to some degree, is designed to suppress, actually, competition to it. If you read the statements of the Europeans, they don't like stable coins. They don't like crypto because it's going to compete with the new digital euro. And that's going to take its effect in the Mediterranean area, probably in North Africa. So you're already starting to see the development of digital currency networks. The old Eurozone, the old dollar zone, were informal zones of influence. The new zones are going to be digitally networked zones. And if you're in that network, you operate in that currency in the network, and it will strengthen the underlying currency. That's the thinking that we need to be thinking about the dollar. We need to be thinking about how do we replace the old zone of influence of the dollar with digital networks of dollars built upon interoperable stablecoins, built upon perhaps some version of a U.S. sovereign digital currency, working alongside. But that's where the world is going. And I think we're going to have a multipolar world of digital currency networks. And whether there'll be a BRICS one as well. I think there could be a fourth player. I think there probably will be a fourth player in that network. And how China's going to have to work that out, both having its own and then a BRICS one, remains to be seen. But I think that's where we're heading. And why wouldn't it, right? That's what's happened in every other walk of life. We've gone to Amazon as a digital network of retail experience, and we've gone to social networks. That's why governments were so afraid of Facebook and Project DM, because of the threat it had. You link that social network with a digital currency, what kind of threat does that create to central bank money? So I think that's the direction we're heading. I think it's going to be multipolar.
We're exceeding our time, but that's only because it's such an interesting conversation. Jelena, any parting thoughts before we?
Buy gold. No, I'm kidding. No, that was a joke. Don't tweet about it, please. So I do think that the social conscious needs to be at a place where even folks who are invested in crypto for reasons that people in Washington like to use as reasons against crypto, for the secrecy and kind of a activity that you don't want everybody to know about, especially your government. I think that generally we need to be more or less aligned behind this notion that we all benefit from the US dollar being where it is now. And if you have ever spent any time in a system that's not like this one, you especially appreciate what the stability of the system brings into everyday orderly living, from the price of milk to the price of oil to the price of the goods that you import from other countries. But I do think that, both from the government's perspective, we need laws on the books. So I'll tell you how this works very simply. First, people talk about new law, and everybody's like, oh, that is so esoteric, that is so out there, that's just crazy. And then somebody introduces a bill, and then that single bill lingers for 2 or 3 Congresses. Each Congress is 2 years, by the way. And so then all of a sudden you have 3 or 4 bills. And when you start seeing 3 or 4 bills and they're bipartisan, something will happen. So I fully expect legislation. I don't know what form it will take. But I do think we're going to get to a better place with digital currency, whatever form that may be. And I'm just really hopeful, as somebody who had to, claw my way to be a United States citizen, to, be able to avail myself of the benefits and privileges of the system, that we are able to maintain, for the goodness of our system and our children, that we're able to maintain the dominance of the US dollar, whatever shape or form it may take.
Well, thank you so much. We are certainly hoping it doesn't take 2 or 4 Congresses to get our stablecoin bill done. But this has been fascinating, and with our deepest gratitude, thank you so much for being here. So let's give them, yeah.